So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Tracy Mckenzie with us tonight. He's recently published a book that I have a copy of. When you want to borrow it later, you can do that and read it for yourself. Um, um, but he is very graciously offering these messages, this opportunity for us to sit and listen to him share without us reading his book together. But I know we should all read the book. But he is sharing about just how Christians think or should be thinking about politics and democracy and our faith and how these things relate to each other, how they inform each other, how they influence each other, and is taking us not in any kind of a partisan way, but is taking us into the story that we're a part of and looking at fact-based, data-based, sourced quotes to take us into not just a story that's kind of mythological in nature, but a story that is that's human and it's spiritual and it's practical, and we are a part of this story. And so these are things that are important for us to be aware of as we are acting in this story. And so I'm really grateful, Dr. Mckenzie, that you're with us, that you are willing to give us this time together tonight. I want to turn things over to you. Oh, Dr. Mckenzie is a professor of history at Wheaton College in near beautiful Chicago, Illinois, and he is just generously giving us this time together now to share some things that I think are really important for us in this particular season. So, welcome, Dr. Mckenzie. I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Let me just say right off the bat that I think it's a gift that you folks are giving me to have this opportunity. I really welcome the opportunity to be in conversation with you all. I should just let you know by way of background, I think of my own sense of calling in terms of two words. I think I'm called to remember and to remind. I want to remember the past, and I want to remind the church, because I think there are ways in which having some historical perspective can actually help us to see our own moment more clearly, to become more aware of some of the things that we believe, perhaps without being particularly conscious of it. And all in all, I think it can help us as we try to follow Christ. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity. Let me also just underscore something Brian said a moment ago. I have zero interest in making any kind of partisan argument. In fact, one of the most common questions that I've received from people who've made it through to the end of my book is something along these lines: okay, but who am I supposed to vote for? And I just want to stress that that's not my goal. If anything, this may sound arrogant, but I think I want to talk to you about something that's more important than who you vote for in the next election, or which party you support, or how you think about a particular policy. I really want to take us back to some more foundational questions that I think Christians living in a democratic society need to be asking, need to be thinking about in a really self-conscious way. So I have two senses of burden. One is, as a historian, I see some warning signs. I certainly believe that democracy is fragile. A lot of my expertise in the last 37 years that I've been a college professor has been the area of the American Civil War. And I don't think you can study the Civil War without concluding that democracy is fragile, that its survival isn't inevitable. But my much deeper burden is absolutely for the testimony of Christians in this moment. Let me just remind you a little bit of the context in which we're talking. maybe we don't need reminding, but there are three trends that really have caught my attention in the last decade or so. One is how we measure trust in government, or how we register trust in government. There have been various organizations, including the Gallup poll organization, that have asked pretty much the same question for the last 60 or 70 years. It's basically, do you trust government to do the right thing? And you can choose from various options. You can say almost always, most of the time, some of the time, almost never. If we went back to the 1960s, if we went back to the early 1960s, if we weren't all muted, I'd ask us to play a game, but you can sort of answer this to yourself. What percentage of Americans would say that I trust government to do the right thing almost always? Well, the answer in 1964 was 79%. 79% of Americans said they thought government could be trusted to do the right thing almost always. That question gets asked every year. The most recent statistic has been released, I think it's from 2 years ago, but at that point it was 17%. So we talk about trust in government, it's dropped just dramatically, it's plummeting. At the same time, distrust of one another, if you sort of generalize broadly about the culture. 30 years ago, if they asked a Republican, do you have a very low opinion of a Democrat? About 1 out of every 5 Republicans said they had a very low opinion of Democrats. They reversed that question, asked a Democrat, do you have a low opinion of a Republican? It was about 1 in 6. Those figures have more than quadrupled in the last 30 years. And I think that wouldn't surprise us, right? When we listen to the rhetoric, we describe members of the other side, whatever that is, not just as people with whom we disagree. We describe them as enemies. We claim that they hate what we love. They want to tear down what is good. So we have a declining trust in government. We have increasing distrust of one another. And then finally, we have apparently more and more disillusionment with democracy itself. That's been measured in a variety of ways, but I can let you know of one key way. One question that survey organizations have been asking now for at least 30 years is this one. What do you think of a form of government that is characterized by a strong leader who does not have to bother with Congress or elections? What do you think about a form of government characterized by a strong leader who does not have to bother with Congress or elections? There's a name for that form of government. The opinion polls don't give you that name. I think that's intentional. The name for that form of government is dictatorship. And yet for almost the last 20 years, between 1/4 and 2/5 of respondents in the United States to those questions when they're posed say that they think that could be a very effective form of government. I think that at least ought to give us pause. I don't think 2/5 of Americans would say, I would like to see us have a dictatorship. But I think it does sort of reflect a growing frustration that so many of us feel with our contemporary politics. So in that moment, I think it really is important for Christians to make sure that we are thinking about politics starting from a biblical foundation. One of the challenges, though, I think, is that there are aspects of our political culture that have existed for so long, almost universally, ubiquitously, that we're really not even aware that they're there. So here's the thing that I would like to stress to you right at the outset. Democracy is much more than a set of institutions. It's much more than a set of processes by which we translate the will of the majority into government policy. Democracy actually can only exist when it's intertwined with a host of values And I think perhaps preeminent among those values is our understanding of human nature, of what that means, what that says about us. So I undertook to write the book that your pastors referred to several years ago, thinking that one of the most important things that we could ask about American democracy is simply this: what is the story that American democracy tells us about who we are, about where our hope lies, about where the greatest threats to our well-being come from? So let's think about that. And to get at that, I think it's important to ask maybe the most foundational question we could conceive of about democracy. And here's the question I think we want to ask: why do we believe in democracy in the first place? Why do we believe in democracy to begin with? Now, if you're like me and if you were born and raised in this country, if you think of yourself as a patriotic citizen of this country, it can almost seem a little bit disloyal or unpatriotic to ask that question. You might think, haven't we answered it definitively that democracy is the best alternative that we have? But I think we need to go back and ask that question. You might sort of play a little game with yourself even now and ask yourself, if I had a neighbor, maybe someone new to this country, who asked me, why do Americans believe in democracy? What would you answer? Would you have a kind of straightforward, quick elevator pitch answer? One of my favorite writers was a visitor to the United States who came to America about 2 centuries ago, almost 2 centuries ago. It was a Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville. He wrote a book after many years of reflection called Democracy in America, which is just a classic interpretation of American democracy. And he said something that has haunted me ever since I read it. He said that most people, when it comes to big questions, fall into one of two categories. He said, either we will not know what to believe, or we will believe what we do not know. I love that observation. He's saying either we just do not know what to believe, or we will have a belief. Maybe we'll think we believe in it very strongly, but we're just not really sure why. Maybe it's a belief that we've inherited from our parents or previous generations. Maybe we've inherited it from the culture around us. But when pressed to justify it, we don't have an answer. I like to share this with my students, and then I'll say, brothers and sisters, these things ought not to be. And why is that? It's because we are called, right? Paul, in his second letter to the Corinthians, says we are called to take every thought captive in obedience to Christ. And surely in a free society that is a self-governing society, taking captive the way we think about our self-government, the way we think about our democratic culture, is something I think Christians need to take seriously. So that, I think, is our aspiration. But here's the problem. I don't think we can think Christianly about values that we're not aware that we hold. And here is sort of the scary thing. I think a lot of the messages that our culture will send us are messages that are so universal that we really don't even notice them. It's almost as if they become invisible. Now, you've probably all heard references to culture wars or things like that. You know that our society argues over many, many things. But I want to suggest it's the things that we agree on, that left and right agree on, blue and red states agree on, Democrats and Republicans agree on. It's those things that are probably shaping us most directly. And we're not even going to be aware of it because we're not hearing anyone discuss them or debate them. And I think the view of human nature that permeates American democracy today is a good example of that. So how can we see the invisible? Well, one way, I think, is to take ourselves figuratively back to another time and place to a time when people didn't see the world exactly the way we see it, who thought of government differently, who thought of human nature perhaps differently than our culture does today. And when we visit those individuals and when we listen to them, they can actually make us aware of some of the things that we have taken for granted. You know, one way to put it, they sort of make things that we think are obvious seem strange now. And so we sort of stop and say, why do I think that way? Why do we hold these values that we do? So what I want to do with you for just a moment or two is to ask this basic question. If we went back to 1787, we went to the Philadelphia Convention where the United States Constitution was being hammered out, what would we hear from the 55 men who gathered and took part in that undertaking? What would we hear them say about human nature? What did they believe about men and women and what motivates us? Let me just share with you a few quotes. I sometimes use a lot of visual aids for this. I consciously didn't do that. I'm just going to try to be as figurative and as dynamic as I can be. But let me challenge you this. Just listen carefully, if you would. I'm going to share maybe half a dozen quotes with you. And I want you to ask yourself, is there a pattern here? Do I hear the same descriptors come up over and over again? And see what you think. One of the things I would say at the outset is that the men who framed the Constitution believed that they had to take human nature as it existed. They couldn't be idealists. They couldn't be utopians. They had to understand actually what motivated men and women. And they were convinced that for a form of government to work over the long haul, it had to be constructed with human nature in mind. And so they said a lot about their understanding of human nature. And so here are some examples. Benjamin Franklin, we'll start with him, one of the most famous Americans of the American Revolutionary period, the oldest member of the Constitutional Convention, 81 years old at the time of the gathering. Franklin said that avarice and ambition are the two most dominant passions in human nature. Avarice and ambition. Avarice, greed. We don't speak in terms of avarice too much anymore. Synonym for greed. He's saying men and women are naturally greedy. Franklin went on to say that the other dominant passion is ambition. Well, what's wrong with that? I joke that, you know, we like it when our grown children show some ambition. We would like to think of ambition in terms of, I'm going to get out there and get a job. I'm going to get out there and be an independent human being. That is one definition and a common one of ambition, and it's a proper one. It's not the most common understanding of ambition over 200 years ago. When Benjamin Franklin is saying that men and women are ambitious or ruled by ambition, he means an inordinate, that means a disordered love of prestige and power and cultural influence and prominence. Ambition was not a virtue. Ambition was a vice. And so Franklin is saying most people are greedy and they want power. George Washington, of course, I think the best known member of the American Revolutionary generation. Washington was the chair of the Constitutional Convention. And Washington said that the motives which predominate most in human affairs are self-love and self-interest. Self-love and self-interest. There's a man named William Livingston, who was a delegate from New Jersey. He said it was extremely difficult, even for the best of human beings, to divest ourselves of self-interest. James Wilson was a delegate from Pennsylvania. He said it is extremely difficult. He says it is the nature of man to pursue his own interest in preference to the good of others. George Mason was a delegate from Virginia. He said, or lamented, what he called the natural lust for power inherent in man. Alexander Hamilton, we know him. He did not wrap this as far as I know, but he did say Men are ambitious. They are rapacious. That's another word for greedy. James Madison, maybe the most influential architect of the Constitution, said self-love is sown into the nature of man. So if you're listening along with me, I think you heard the same thing over and over and over again. The idea that we are self-interested, that we pursue our own interests naturally, even when it's at the detriment of others. Self-love, greed, desire for power and influence. These are the characteristics that the framers are associating with human nature. Now, I want to stress that they didn't think that this was all. If they thought that we are only selfish, we are only greedy for power, they would not have advocated self-government.
I think Dr. Mckenzie has been accidentally muted. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I don't know how that happened, but thank you. So are you hearing me now? All right. So I promise I wasn't even touching anything, but who knows? Let me just repeat just a few things. So I want you to understand that the framers saw human nature as complicated. They thought that there was great potential for wonderful behavior, for compassion and courage and generosity. They just didn't think that those were the default of human nature. The default is self-interest. The default is selfishness. And so they believed that while they hoped that individuals who held office would be disinterested, would be courageous, would have integrity, they said it would be naive to structure government taking that for granted or assuming that that would be the case. Their assumption would be that men and women instead pursue their own self-interest, even to the detriment of others. Well, this is the predominant understanding of human nature that informed our Constitution. I like to tell my students that every article, every section, almost every line of the Constitution is constructed with this in mind. What I want us, though, to recognize and sort of really be sort of shocked by is how quickly the country abandoned this understanding of human nature. Sometimes the story that we tell ourselves about our country is one in which we have a very noble beginning and then have a long period of relative flourishing. And then we begin to see a rapid fracturing of America, maybe a descent. I had a pastor who used to joke it all started when the Beatles came to America. Maybe you have a different understanding, but it's something fairly recent that triggers some significant movement away from a traditional set of values. I actually don't think that's what history shows us. I actually think, particularly with regard to human nature, that there was a movement away from the framers' understanding that set in at the most within a couple of generations. So what we might do to illustrate that is to sort of leapfrog forward. So if you want in your mind, you can think of yourself taking a big jump. And we'll go from the 1780s to the 1820s and the 1830s. So let's move forward 40 or 50 years. Then let us ask basically the same question. What did prominent individuals, prominent thinkers, and political figures in that era think about human nature? Let me just give you a few examples. Let me start with, arguably, these aren't all names that you would recognize, unlike maybe the framers of the Constitution. But I want to assure you they were very prominent, very influential figures in their day. There's a man named John O'Sullivan, who was the editor of the most widely circulated magazine in America in the 1830s. This man, O'Sullivan, said that any understanding of human nature that implies a distrust of mankind is degrading in its tendency and absurd in theory. He said it's fundamentally degrading to say that men and women are selfish. It's absurd to make that claim. He wouldn't hear it. He said Americans would have no patience with it. There's a man named George Bancroft. Again, not a name I would necessarily expect you to recognize. He was actually one of the first historians of the United States, but he was also a prominent political figure. He was a cabinet member in the 1840s. He was an ambassador to Great Britain for a period of time. And this is what Bancroft said. He said, the Spirit of God breathes through the combined intelligence of the people. That the closest thing, the highest authority on earth, the closest possible to infallibility is the will of the majority. So if you're going to say that, doesn't it make sense that you have to have a different understanding of human nature? If you start out with men and women are basically selfish, would you say the closest thing to God's voice on earth is what men and women agree to? That would make no sense whatsoever. Maybe you would recognize this name, Herman Melville. Herman Melville was a writer famous for, I suppose, a variety of novels, but particularly for Moby Dick. Maybe you've come across that novel in your past at some point. This is what Melville had one of the characters of one of his novels say. And we know that it's really the author speaking here. It's the message he wants his reader to take away, because he puts it in the mouth of this character in the last page or so of the novel. White Jacket was the name of the novel. This speaker says, we Americans are the peculiar, chosen people. God expects great things from us. Long enough have we been skeptics with regard to ourselves and have doubted whether the political Messiah had come. But he has come in us. So what Herman Melville was saying, the Messiah has come, and he has come in the rise of democratic culture. Really sort of echoing George Bancroft, the closest thing to the voice of God on earth is the will of the majority. And then let me just end with one final example, and this name you probably will recognize, and that is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States, and in many ways, the individual who leaves his stamp on this period of American history more than any other. He's president from the late 1820s to the mid-1830s. In his farewell address to the nation, when he is announcing that he will not be a candidate for another term, he says, I have great confidence in the virtue of a great majority of the people. Let me stop there for just a moment. Virtue is another one of these words that has sort of changed in its meaning over time. Today, we tend to think of virtue probably in terms of private behavior, maybe in particular in terms of sexual chastity. Virtue, as Jackson understood it, was self-denial for the general welfare, for the common good. So whereas the framers said men and women are selfish, even if it harms other people, Jackson says men and women are naturally unselfish. They actually sacrifice their own interests for the good of the whole. He says, I have great confidence in the virtue of a great majority of the people. He goes on. He says the people are enlightened. They are patriotic. They are marked by good sense and practical judgment. They are distinguished for their intelligence, for their high tone of moral character. He says the American people are uncorrupted and the American people are incorruptible. Not only are we willing always to put others first, there is nothing that could possibly persuade us to do otherwise. We are naturally incorruptible. What I want you to hear and feel here is how new this is, how different this is. We couldn't imagine one of the framers of the Constitution saying that. Today, Jacksonian rhetoric is so common that we don't hear it. If you think for a moment Think about any sort of typical campaign address. Doesn't matter which party it comes from, doesn't matter anything about the particulars involved. You will hear, if you begin to listen for it, these kinds of tributes to the natural goodness of American people. This is what I call in my book the democratic gospel. The democratic gospel is the good news that we are fundamentally okay. The typical campaign rhetoric is going to do usually at least three different things. It's going to say, you are good. And they might say that using different terminology. They might say, you're hardworking, you're law-abiding, you're a good citizen. But in some way or other, they are going to send you the message that you're good. In other words, you're not part of the problem. The second thing that they will do is they will suggest that in some way, your way of life is under attack. Maybe your way of life is under attack from this particular threat from abroad, maybe from this particular policy from the current administration. There's almost an endless number of threats that can be identified. But the message will say, you are good, you are not part of the problem. There lies the threat to your well-being. And finally, any campaign speechwriter that's worth their salt will have the message that allows the candidate to say, and I will be your champion, or I will be your protector. I will guard you against this threat. So what I would want you just to acknowledge, if you stop and think about it, is that this is a message that so permeates American political rhetoric that it becomes like white noise. But at its heart is a message that is fundamentally a contradiction of what the framers of the Constitution would have said. Now let's figure out, so what? Let's ask that question. What difference does it make? Well, I want to share something with you. It's not my insight originally at all. It's an insight from the English Christian writer C.S. Lewis from an essay maybe 75 years ago. And I'm not going to quote it directly. I'm just going to paraphrase it for you. Before I paraphrase, I want to just call your attention to something that may not have made obvious. The framers of the Constitution believed that in a free society, the majority must ultimately prevail. They absolutely believe that. They said, if you live in a society where the majority does not ultimately prevail, you do not live in a self-governing society. Jacksonian Americans, Andrew Jackson and others, absolutely believed that the majority should prevail. So both of these groups agreed that the majority must rule. And that leads us to this rather startling realization. The realization is that there are only two basic reasons to believe in majority rule. One is because you have faith in human nature. The other is because you don't. So let me take you through that for just a moment. I want to make sure that you follow Lewis's reasoning. Lewis said, on the one hand, you might, as Andrew Jackson and Americans ever since have, you might start with the assumption that human beings are basically good, that they are naturally unselfish. And once you believe that, it makes sense to you that all of us deserve a voice in public policy. That if we are naturally good and naturally wise, then the general welfare suffers if everyone's voice isn't heard. That would be an argument for democracy grounded in a positive understanding of human nature. On the other hand, you might think that men and women are naturally selfish, naturally ambitious, naturally willing to sacrifice the welfare of others if it serves their own needs. If you believe that is generally true of human nature, then you would say it is dangerous to let any small minority or any one individual exercise power over everyone else. You would include instead that the safest approach would be to distribute power as broadly as possible to discourage the concentration of power and hopefully to mitigate the effects of human selfishness. If you followed the argument that Lewis was making, I hope you see then that we can be 180 degrees apart from one another in our understanding of human nature and ultimately arrive at the same conclusion, which is that we support rule or will of the majority as the governing principle. So for the rest of what I'm going to share, I want you to make a note mentally or maybe write it down. Do not go onto social media after we're done and say, Wheaton College professor argues against democracy. Okay? Please don't. What I do want to throw out there, and I mean for this to be sort of intentionally provocative, I want to argue that most Americans have embraced democracy for the wrong reason. That's not that they shouldn't embrace democracy, but they have embraced it for the wrong reason. And I think we might argue that much of the dysfunction of American democracy today, much of the extreme polarization that characterizes American democracy today, comes from Americans embracing the wrong foundation for our belief in majority rule. Now, I'm not a theologian, or I'm not a Bible scholar per se. I am a historian. But I want to just share with you how I make sense of this shift as a Christian, this shift that we see from the 1780s to the 1830s and thereafter. To do that, I want to make use of two concepts in Scripture, two concepts that have been important to church teaching ever since the establishment of the church, having to do with human nature, and use those as categories for thinking about how the framers thought and about how Americans have thought typically in the political realm since the 1830s. The first concept is simply the idea that each of us bears the image of God. Sometimes scholars, I don't know why necessarily why this is the habit, but sometimes they'll use the term imago Dei, which is Latin for image of God. We believe that the Bible teaches, and the church has taught for centuries, for millennia, that we are created in the image of God, which means, among other things, we've been endowed with an immortal soul, with the faculty of reason, with a capacity for moral discernment, all of which separates us from the rest of God's creation and makes us, as the scripture teaches, really the crowning glory of God's creation, just a little lower than the angels. So on the one hand, there is a preciousness and intrinsic dignity to every man, woman, boy, and girl, because we are bearers of the divine image. C.S. Lewis, I'll quote him again. I think he conveyed this really well in one of his writings. He said, "There are no ordinary people." I just love that statement. There are no ordinary people. He goes on to say, "You have never talked to a mere mortal." Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat, he said. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. There are no ordinary people. So on the one hand, we take seriously that dear truth about the preciousness of human beings as image bearers of the Creator. On the other hand, the other concept that I think is so relevant here is the doctrine usually referred to as the doctrine of original sin. It's not a phrase that appears per se in Scripture. The concept, you can argue, is there. The wording is usually associated or attributed to St. Augustine, who was an African bishop in the late 5th and early 6th century. And Augustine basically said that because of the rebellion of our first parents, because of the fall, as it's sometimes referred to by theologians, we come into the world having inherited a certain nature that, rather than being naturally unselfish, is actually naturally selfish and self-centered. Augustine said that there's sort of two overriding motives that guide human behavior. He said we are characterized by recalcitrance. That's a long word we don't use a whole lot today. A kind of almost reflexive resistance to authority. Who are you to tell me what to do? I will govern myself. I will be my own God. Augustine said the other driving motive is what later scholars called concupiscence, which is illicit or sinful desire. We want what we want to govern ourselves, and anything that stands between us and those desires will become our enemy. So this is the idea of original sin. It's not the idea that we sometimes make mistakes. It's not the idea that we occasionally sin. It's the idea that when we sin out of our nature. I want to argue that our Constitution was created in such a way that it actually is compatible simultaneously with these two understandings. What I am not arguing, what I would not say, is that the framers of the Constitution were citing chapter and verse, or quoting Augustine, or explicitly saying, I'm drawing from Christian doctrine. Because the reality is, I do not find them doing that. So I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, as we strive to think Christianly, I see them making decisions that are absolutely compatible with these two truths that we need to hold in tension. They would not have created a form of self-government without believing that there was a capacity in men and women to behave selflessly, to engage in moral discernment that would lead to wise decisions. It would have made no sense if they denied that possibility. On the other hand, at the same time, all of the checks and balances that they wrote into the Constitution, the way that they structured the format of the government, was designed with the belief that humans tended to pursue their own self-interest. So in a way that I think is complicated, but very deft and clever, they create a government that was compatible for human beings, created in the image of God, but human beings who had fallen and who are now characterized by sin nature. I've hinted already at where I think we are today, and I want to just talk about that ever so briefly. But I want to do so with these two ideas in mind. I want to suggest that the framers were able to hold these two ideas in tension when they created the Constitution, but that within 2 generations, Americans had largely, not entirely, but had largely begun to abandon one of those two, holding on to the idea of men and women created in the image of God, holding on to the preciousness of the individual, and gradually, but sort of inexorably, throwing overboard the idea of a sin nature. Now, I'm not saying that all preachers did that from the pulpit, although some did over the course of the 19th century. But what I am saying is that in our public square, in the way that we talk to one another and about one another politically, in the speeches that our political candidates made, in the political pamphlets that we authored and read, any kind of appreciation for mankind's fallenness pretty much evaporates. I've stressed this already, but let me just give you one other example of this today. You may have heard references to populism. I don't know if that's a term that you have come across. Populism in American politics today. So-and-so is characterized as a populist candidate, a populist Democrat, or a populist Republican. Let me just unpack that for you really fast because it's the dominant story that's being told today. Populism is a plot, really, for a story. I don't know if any of you know the children's game Mad Libs, where you have statements with just blanks that you fill in however you want to. In a sense, populism is like Mad Libs. You can fill in the blanks, you can change the particulars, but the overarching story stays the same. The people, however that's defined, are under attack by some small group of enemies of the people. And to protect the people, a champion of the people will rise up and vanquish their enemies. I don't know that we talk about it so much in 2024, but I guarantee you we did in 2020 and 2022. When you talk about QAnon, if you've heard of that conspiracy theory, QAnon is just a variation of populism, where it says the people are being threatened by a bad minority who in secret are the enemies of the people, bad people doing things secretly that need to be vanquished. So I want to suggest that we are bombarded from every direction by political messages that have one overarching statement, one overarching message. To solve the problems that we face does not require any change in human nature. That the problems that plague us exist wholly outside of ourselves. If other people will change, all will be right. And I want to just suggest that maybe one of the best things that we can do as we try to be discerning in our listening to political rhetoric is to take to heart a challenge from the writer of a the writing of a Russian Christian named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was born right after the First World War in Russia and grew to maturity in between the First and Second World War in that country, and then becomes a member of the Soviet Army during World War II. And then just before the end of that war, he actually wrote something in a private letter in which he was critical of the dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. And when that letter was confiscated and read, it led to his arrest and his incarceration for 8 years in a labor camp in Siberia. He reflected on his experience there and ultimately shared some of his reflections in his writings. One in particular stands out. Solzhenitsyn talked in particular about one of the guards at the labor camp where he was a prisoner, about a guard that he said was sadistic, who was sort of joyfully cruel and brutal. Solzhenitsyn came to hate him until he had a kind of insight that he believed was given him by God, which was that he, meaning Solzhenitsyn, had he an opportunity to walk in the shoes of that prison guard, could imagine himself being just as brutal, just as cruel, just as sadistic. And so Solzhenitsyn wrote this. He said, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, not between political parties, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts." One question then that you might ask yourself when you listen to the next campaign speech or read the next political rhetoric or the next article on social media: where is this writer or speaker drawing the line that separates good and evil? And I think you'll find almost always that the line is being drawn outside of our hearts. I'm going to conclude here, and we're going to go to Q&A in just a moment, but here's, I guess, my challenge to us all. This is not an insight, what I've been sharing with you, that tells you who to vote for. It doesn't tell you which party to support. But I hope it is challenging us to do something that actually is a first order that should come before. And that is to awaken ourselves to the fact that every campaign speech is a sermon. Almost every campaign speech is making a religious argument, although it won't say that explicitly. And the danger to us is that our hearts are being systematically shaped by the rhetoric that we hear. And it doesn't matter, if I can say it again, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle it comes from. It tends to be interchangeable, and it is absolutely antithetical to the gospel message. So whatever that means for you personally in next steps, I would challenge you to begin with what I would call first steps, which is to awaken our hearing, maybe as if for the first time, to hear the rhetoric that bombards us, and to ask God to help us to think Christianly about it, to quote, take every thought captive. I believe that the degree to which we have embraced this very, very unscriptural view of human nature, it makes every challenge to a flourishing democracy that haunts us today that much more difficult. I'll be happy to explain what I mean by that. But I think we've spent enough time now. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for responses and questions.
Oh, thank you so much. So much there to think about and talk about. Does anybody want to break the ice with a question? You can drop it into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question if you want to do that.
I don't have a question per se, but I would just like to say thank you so much, because this was a very refreshingly intellectual thing to listen to. So, which is not something I feel like I've had the opportunity to engage with in church for a very long time. Today was actually my first day visiting Vineyard Church. So this was very refreshing to just hear an objective, intellectual, thought-provoking perspective. I just really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, hey, Margaret. Anybody else want to
There's a question in the chat, Pastor Brian.
Oh, I
Yeah, I
Oh.
put it wrong.
yeah, I see it there.
So first, I guess, did I hear you correctly?
You definitely did. So am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for your question. I think it's Phil, maybe.
Yeah.
Yes, you did hear me correctly. And I think it's a great question because maybe I can make it seem more concrete and less abstract. So one of the characteristics of the Constitution that maybe, you learn about a little bit in junior high or high school, and then it sort of fades from memory over time, is what's called the checks and balances that are written into the Constitution. And what that means basically is that the framers of the Constitution said, we want to divide government into, in the case of the United States, 3 separate component branches. And we want to divide it intentionally, requiring some agreement among more than one of these branches before the government can accomplish really any significant undertaking. So, for example, within the legislative branch, you would divide it into 2 houses, right? A House and a Senate. And you're going to elect those differently, different terms in different ways. And you're going to require that both houses agree before anything can pass. This was self-consciously different from what was proposed by some other writers at the time, which is that you want a single House legislature that creates the minimum impediment to the immediate and direct expression of the will of the majority. Framers don't want to do that. We have to have both houses agree. But then what has to happen after that? No law becomes law just because the House and Senate agree to it until the executive branch, the president, signs that, endorses it. So now you have to have the agreement of both the legislative branch and the executive branch for a measure to become law. And yet, you have a third branch, the judicial branch, and the judicial branch is given some authority to review the constitutionality of the actions of the other two branches. So I could go into more detail, but it's that kind of idea. If you want to think about it, the framers were really wanting to slow down the process of government, and that probably frustrates us because we think government is really slow right now. But they would have said, remember that our natural impulses are selfish, that we have the capacity morally to push back against those, but that our first inclinations are rarely going to be very morally reliable inclinations. So they thought that actually by slowing down government and requiring multiple branches to agree, it would tend to, not guarantee, but tend to lead to better outcomes. I hope that was helpful.
Very much. Thank you.
Can I ask? You say you're not a theologian, but can I just? We'll call this a theological historical question.
Okay. Okay.
So, as you know, as you're describing this change in, from the framers to then, the next, couple generations after that, I guess the observation I would make is that at least within the evangelical church, or maybe that's the best way to say it, within the evangelical church, it feels like to me that if we looked at the progression of the narrative as we have embraced it, we tend to do the same. I'm trying to think exactly, there's a bad guy out there, and we are the ones who can protect you from that bad guy. And so put your trust in us, and and we're going to rescue you from this bad. And I guess it feels like to me we've really utilized that narrative in order to kind of popularize our message.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that reflection, Brian. And I don't want to speak too dogmatically, but I just would say that I think this overarching message is one that really does permeate all sectors of the culture. Maybe not simultaneously, but it really sort of reaches to every extent of the culture. And so I see a lot of overlap, at least a lot of compatibility between the way that political rhetoric changes, say in the first half century after the Constitution, and the way that religious rhetoric changes. What I don't know, I think it's hard to say for sure, is there a cause and effect relationship? Is the church driving political change? Is the church imitating political change? I don't know the answer to that, but they seem to be sort of echoing or rhyming with one another, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
we
maybe
know,
rhyming, yeah.
as Christians, we believe that there is evil external to ourselves. We don't deny that.
Yeah.
So there's a place for that. But I think generally, if you have a good PR consultant, they're going to say that the message that leads with the sin within the own heart is not always the most effective way to attract the following, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else before I start asking more questions? Anybody else want to jump in with a question you have been
It's another
Oh.
question in the chat.
in the chat? Thank you. Derek, do you want me to read it or do you want to unmute?
Either.
You go for it.
The question I wrote was, how much do you think that the acceptance of the Jacksonian idea of human nature being good in the USA could be viewed as a type of justification of the systemic and institutional oppression needed to enslave Africans and their descendants, which was pretty popular of the time?
Yeah. Boy, that's a great question. It's gonna. I want to, sort of proceed slowly because I don't know that I've wrestled with exactly that question.
I guess part of the reason that it comes to mind anytime I'm looking at history, I always think through my ancestors, and I wonder where they were and what they were doing during that time period. So, I mean, my family history, we've traced our family 5 generations into enslavement.
Wow.
So one of the first things I thought of when we were talking about Andrew Jackson, which was the namesake of the high school I went to, was about Andrew Jackson. And I just did a quick Google search about him being a slave owner and just how prevalent the 2 plantations that he owned were. So obviously his rhetoric that he believed was mainly towards white men.
Yeah. So that's a great observation, Derek. So let me just sort of think out loud with you a little bit. All right, this is not super well thought out. You're right about Jackson being a slave owner. If you ever have the opportunity to visit his main plantations called the Hermitage right outside of Nashville, I actually describe it a little bit in the book that your pastor referred to that I've written recently. If you go there, it's very interesting because when you pull up, he has, this very elaborate kind of circular drive leading up to the white columned mansion and so forth. And from the front of the house, you would not know that there were any people of color on the site. You would not have any inkling that this man was a slave owner. And then when you go out the back, it's almost like a village in that you have row upon row of slave cabins, and you have all the different sort of activities of a working slave owning plantation. There's nothing sort of accidental about that, that sort of kept, out of sight. But Jackson did own more than 100 slaves, certainly was passionately a supporter of slavery, and as you may know, a passionate supporter of the removal of Native Americans from the eastern half of the United States. That's another policy that's really associated with his presidency. So you put your finger on something that I think is really fascinating to think about when we think about our past. Almost exactly at the time that Americans are embracing this idea that we are naturally good, they are becoming more and more committed to either slavery in the areas where slavery thrives or segregation in the rest of the country, and to a removal of indigenous people, Native American people, from the presence of the eastern half of the United States. So these things are happening simultaneously, and knowing what to do with that is hard. I'm not certain that I've come across an argument that the belief of human nature is basically good somehow is tied into the justification of slavery. But here's where I do see a kind of link. If you go back to the 18th century, there was a common argument among political thinkers which said that even though all people may be created in the image of God, people aren't equally prepared to have a voice in the government of society. In other words, their view of society was unapologetically hierarchical. Some people really have superior abilities, superior moral qualities, and they deserve to rule. So, for example, in every one of the 13 colonies, there was a requirement to have a fair amount of land before you could vote. If you were a woman, you could not vote. If you were a person of color, you could not vote. If you were a slave or if you were an indentured servant, you could not vote. Pretty much only white adult male landowners. Estimate would be maybe a third to a half of adult white males can vote. Even the majority of adult white males don't vote. Then in that period by the 1830s, you have a real movement toward letting all adult males vote. And a lot of the justification for that is, well, it's because they are by nature wise and good. And so there's no real justification for denying that. What happens at the same time that you have the expansion of voting for white males, though, is that you have more and more systematic exclusion of people of color. There were some people of color who actually voted in colonial America. It was always a small minority. But if a black male could meet a property requirement in many of the colonies, that black male could vote. One of the things that happens to laws in the early 1800s is that the restrictions are changed. So no longer is property a requirement, but now skin color and sex become a requirement. So what the connection of all this is, I don't know. But at the very least, we would say, even as Americans are using this rhetoric of natural goodness, they are finding different ways to make distinctions to limit access to political power. So that's a very good question. And I sort of rambled all around the barn on that one. It's worthy of more thought for sure.
Can I ask a question?
Thank you.
I'm a sociologist, and so I studied some of this, but from a different perspective. You know, on the one hand, you go back to de Tocqueville back in the 1880s, and his observation was that unlike the more collectivistic nature, habits of, the habits of the heart, which the term he used, that unlike the habits of the heart of most of the European countries of which he also made observations, the habits of the heart of Americans were highly individualistic, much more individualistic than what he was used to. Okay. And a lot of his observations are about the way that individualism, was expressed. He's struggling with that in terms of how democracy can operate when there's not a collectivistic caring, when the individualism has reached the point where a democracy has to work with these checks and balances because of the fear of the rights, the Bill of Rights. You have to have rights for individuals. You have to have rights there, to be able to make that work. And then you have Bella writing Habits of the Heart, 100 years later. And he's now looking at that same kind of in that same perspective and saying, it was nothing back in the 1880s like it is in the 1980s. It's much more individualistic. And he talks about, the therapeutic stream, he's really contrasting how sacred, because Bella is a Christian, but how there's this intersection between the sacred and the secular as both being highly individualistic. And he takes on the evangelical church and the fact that so much emphasis is on the individual rather than the community. And the church is really a collection of individuals as opposed to a community around some common purpose. And then you get, then you get Bowling Alone and your whole other sets of series, all basically highlighting this sickness, if you will, of aloneness, the sickness of people. No, and I think to some extent that feeling of being isolated. I mean, that politics grabs that. Our politics today is very much about, capturing that sense of isolation, of being lonely, of being afraid of people, and then of course so much of the social media just feeds on that. And of course we end up with suicides and all kinds, mental illness, a whole lot of things that are in that stream. I just, you're taking us one set of streams, in your history, and then I look at that history through a little bit different lens.
Yeah.
And come up with that same sense that individualism that you took us back to in the 1870s, 1770s, excuse me, 80s, that individualism has morphed into the point where, we laugh at our Canadian neighbors. I sent a cartoon to some of my friends, about, these migrants are at a fence and they can't get across. And it turns out it wasn't the southern border. It's that the Canadians wouldn't let us come in because, they don't want this kind of, crazy individualism that Americans have. And I agree with you. It's very, democracy can be very fragile when individualism and loneliness and fear are the prevailing habits of the heart.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Can I speak to that just a bit? I appreciate your reflections very much. And I don't want to geek out here too much on Tocqueville, but I will say if you want to pick up the book, I devote about a fifth of the book to Tocqueville. So Tocqueville actually comes to the United States in 1831. So he comes right in the middle of Andrew Jackson's presidency, and in his book Democracy in America, he uses a word that is translated in its first English translation, individualism.
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't coin the concept, but as far as I know, that 1838 English translation is the first time individualism had appeared in the English language. So he is definitely seeing individualism. What he comments on, it often gets quoted for, is saying that Americans had this habit of association. He said that they would come together in these civic organizations that weren't really political per se. They weren't private. They were communities coming together to accomplish things. And he saw that as a kind of way to mitigate some of this rampant individualism.
Yes.
However, I was asking a very specific question. What's the understanding of human nature? And Tocqueville would have said, the only reason Americans associate with one another is there are certain things that they think they can get from that association that they can't accomplish by themselves. I actually start the book with a little vignette where Tocqueville is quoted supposedly by Hillary Clinton when she's accepting the Democratic nomination for president in 2016. And what she says is that America is great because America is good. And it turns out that that's a quote that's been attributed to Alexis de Tocqueville thousands of times, used by many politicians. And it's also the case that he absolutely never said it and didn't believe it. He actually saw Americans' association as quite selfish, but he called it self-interest rightly understood. That's the way it was translated. Americans are totally self-interested, he said. They're just rational in the way that they do about it. They're not self-destructive. They don't do stupid things in their individualism. But he said, make no doubt, they are pursuing their self-interest. I'm impressed. I I'm not calling out any particular party, but in 2024, Ben Carson, in his speech before the Republican National Convention, he gives the whole quote about how Tocqueville said America is great because America is good. And I thought everybody had read my book and now knew that that wasn't true. What Tocqueville found, I think, is that Americans thought they were good. He said the Americans absolutely would not tolerate an outsider from criticizing them, and have come to believe that they are almost members of a unique race, he put it. So he is actually fairly critical, and he's very critical of the American church. And I think we've taken one quote, which he actually never said, and forgotten much of everything else that he said.
Wow. Wow. I think we're coming close to the end of our time, and Dr. Jomo has asked a question. If we can get you to take the bait, we'll make this our last one. Michael, do you want to say it, or do you want me to read it?
I can read it out. Thank you, Pastor Brian. And I do ask, whilst you did not tell the listener who to vote for, what are the three things you would ask them to consider and who they vote for, or even maybe abstain from voting?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I appreciate the way that you framed it, because you gave me a way to wiggle out from being too specific. I start with a view that you may not agree with. I think is at least worth considering, that the kind of question of who to vote for is going to be something that the Bible will not explicitly lead us to one and one only conclusion. That is to say, I think it is a question that requires wisdom. And this side of heaven, I think it's a question that authentic, sincere Christians can disagree about. And one of the reasons I don't like to share my own view is I don't like to feed the idea that the historical and religious perspective I share points toward one and one only conclusion. I do want to say, so here's two things to, or at least a couple of things to consider. Whatever you think about policy, first of all, you're going to have to make some decisions in your mind. Which are the policy questions that are paramount? But once you've arrived at that decision, I would challenge you not to think that the rhetoric that is used to promote a policy is irrelevant. I think that we have fallen into a trap, and I say we, I mean sort of generally, I think probably conservative American Christians have fallen into a trap that says policy matters, rhetoric is irrelevant. I actually think that in the way that our political involvement shapes our hearts, that the rhetoric is the more important. There is an argument that people in literature, political science, in those fields would make, they would say that the story that we ultimately embrace may be the most important decision that we make in our lives. And I think that the rhetoric that we encounter in political choices is doing more to shape our sense of who we are than any specific policy decision. So I can't tell you who to vote for, but I am going to, really encourage you to ask God to help you have ears to hear those messages about who we are. And it's possible that you may ultimately say, I'm going to have to vote for, a candidate who tells me a message I don't believe. But I think being aware of that and having a reason for doing that is much less dangerous, much less threatening to your soul
And finally,
than to accept the story uncritically without any kind of discernment.
mhm.
One other thing, and this is sort of scary, I suppose. I think monitoring the own information that you take in, that all of us, I don't mean just you, of course, I mean all of us, taking inventory of the messages that we hear. I suspect your pastor wouldn't mind me saying we'd be better off spending more time ingesting scripture than listening to talk radio or scrolling our news feed. That making sure we are constantly sort of washing ourselves in God's truth might help us more to have the discernment we need to hear those messages in the public square.
Mhm.
I fear, well, I could say more, but you asked a good question. That's a rambling answer. It boils down to rhetoric matters. The words that we use. Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And I think that applies in political rhetoric as much as in any other area of life.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Great answer. Thank you. Super helpful. We're coming up on the half hour, and so we are going to give our appreciation to Dr. Mckenzie and our thanks, and just tell you, Dr. Mckenzie, thank you so much for being with us, spending this time, investing in us. We are very grateful for this. And so your book is called We the Fallen People, and that's an IVP book. Probably Amazon or IVP are the best two sources for that, or you can talk to me and I will possibly loan you my copy if you promise to bring it back. But Amazon, I'm sure you can get it probably tomorrow if you do it before you go to bed tonight. And it's definitely readable. And I say when saying that, I mean it is a book that is full of information. It's full of sources, quotes, and so it is in that sense it's more academic than popular, but it is a book anybody can pick up and make their way through and find it really helpful and meaningful. So again, thank you, Dr. Mckenzie. We would really appreciate your time. We appreciate all the hard work of studying and scholarship that you've put in to be able to bring us this time and give us these insights. And so we will, I think we will leave this conversation at this point. Everybody feel free to jump into comments and say thanks to Dr. Mckenzie. And then we look forward to down the road being able to have another conversation with you. There's just a lot here for us to mine. And so thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks for your time this evening. I think in the days ahead, this is going to be, I know for me, this is one of the most important conversations that I've had. And so thanks for being a part of it.
And can I just say,
Thank you.
Brian,
Please.
I'm so grateful for you folks for your time, and I wish God's great blessing on your congregation. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you so much.